Good morning, class. Welcome back. I apologize. I just came back from actually meeting with a number of you. We were scheduled to have class today, Tuesday, to make up for the fact that we missed yesterday's meeting because I was gone at a meeting in Olympia. Anyway, unknown to me, there is another class that uses our classroom on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we also made some efforts to try to meet elsewhere, and those didn't work out. So it may be just as well. I think the nature of today's lesson may lend itself best to having this lecturette. But anyway, I appreciate your patience and your persistence with me on this. And today I'm going to make some comments. I'll try to keep them to a relatively brief screencast, and then I would like you to view a brief New York Times article / news story on some developments in the computer, or actually iPad industry in China, and how that reveals a bit about these themes of globalization and democratization. I also had a chance to look briefly at some of your discussion forum responses to Liu Xiaobo, and from what I could tell, you were really capturing what I thought was the essence of that story and what it has to teach us about globalization and democratization here in the early 21st century. So bravo on that front. Later on today I will be sitting down and entering brief grades and assessments of your efforts. So thank you. Anyway, this is our objective today. We're going to be looking at globalization and democratization and how they are of unique help and unique significance as we try to make sense of many of the developments and stories that we're hearing from different world regions. And as we start next week moving into actual world regions and examining them more closely, we'll notice that these themes of globalization and democratization are very much at front and center of developments in the world today. So first off, globalization. Globalization is a really big idea, and in fact we could teach a course just about globalization. And like many big ideas, globalization can sometimes be thought of as so big that its meaning starts to lose significance. But I want to tell you about globalization using broad strokes, and then I want to get a little more specific about it in the next slide. But anyway, when we talk about globalization, we're looking at how, particularly in the past 500 years or so, although you could make a case that, going back to things like the Silk Road, which was in effect all the way 2,000 years ago during the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty of China, you can make the argument that globalization has been around for thousands of years. But the last 500 years has brought the world ever more closely together and has really forced large, distant regions of the world to coexist. And in some ways that's been peaceful coexistence. In many other ways it's been non-peaceful. It's been anything but peaceful. And in the last 50 years or so, the world has taken yet another step toward globalization as we've seen technology, trade relationships, migration patterns of people, the flows, the geographic flows, remember that term, those influences that have been able to find their way into and out of various world regions. So globalization is a critical thing for geographers to think about. This interconnection among people, different places throughout the world, it seems to be the general trend, the general momentum. There are some examples of people and groups that are fighting globalization and that are fighting this interconnection, but it seems that, at least for now, at the end of the day, the process and the momentum of globalization seems to be carrying our world forward. We can think of globalization as part of these interregional linkages. And interregional linkages, you can think about these. These are the relationships or the strands that hold different regions of the world together. Interregional linkages, incidentally, is not that different from the term geographic flow. But a flow can be a little bit more broadly applied. A flow is just an influence, and that's kind of a a concept that lends itself to broad interpretation. These interregional linkages are probably a little more concrete in the sense that, a trade agreement or the political cooperation, say that maybe Brazil has as it is a member of the United Nations General Assembly. Those are a little bit more formal than, say, just a simple geographic flow. But more on that as the quarter develops. Globalization brings together these linkages, these flows, and it seems as though these linkages and flows are becoming greater each day. More and more linkages are developing, more and more trade agreements, more and more political agreements, treaties, agreements to work with one another. Sanctions are an effort by many countries in the world to put pressure on a country that is not acting within the global consensus of what is acceptable behavior. And so in the case of Iran and its nuclear ambitions, sanctions have been used. And for the most part, as I said, these linkages and flows are becoming greater and greater. Okay, so let's get a little more specific about this. So facets of globalization. So if we want to define globalization, we could describe it as the spread of cultures, ideas, technologies, and then we even have crime and environmental influences. And I'll talk more about that at the bottom of this slide. But essentially what's driving this process of globalization is that it's easier in the 21st century for one culture on Earth to come in contact with other cultures. And when you bring cultures together, rarely does one culture just triumph over the other. Usually there's a sharing and a blending of influences. Although some would say that in the case of North America and in the case of Europe, two very powerful regions of the world over the past 50 years, that perhaps North American and European culture has spread into other parts of the world in a way that has really crowded out or swallowed up some of the unique aspects of cultures in different regions of the world. Of course, with this spread of culture, there are also ideas. So an idea could be something like communism, like capitalism. An idea could be a less big or less encompassing set of influences. An idea could be as simple as what would be an example of a technological idea that might trump things. Let me move on. I don't want to get bogged down too much of that. Technologies. So technology is one good example of technologies. The World Wide Web. Prior to 1990, China did not have to, the government of China did not have to deal with the fact that influences via the World Wide Web would be coming in contact with its people. It was easier for the Chinese government to sort of maintain power over its people because it wasn't competing with some of these outside influences. Also with globalization, we have interesting things like crime. For example, here we have Osama bin Laden. Really, Al-Qaeda is a phenomenon of globalization in a roundabout way. And in a really interesting way, because Al-Qaeda, as a terrorist group, its primary purpose is to rid the Middle East, or the Holy Lands, as the Muslim people think of their region of the world, rid it from the Western presence. And so what's interesting is on some level, Al-Qaeda wants to deglobalize. It doesn't want the spread of influence and ideas and technologies and cultures from other parts of the world to come and quote-unquote contaminate the Middle East or the Islamic world. But interestingly enough, Al-Qaeda employs some of the very things that it detests, like it uses technology for its communication. It uses technology for its design and carrying out of some of its terrorist acts. And so crime is also part of this phenomenon of globalization. Other examples, global trafficking of, sex trafficking, particularly of minors, illegal behavior in that regard. Environmental influences, disease. The spread of disease is much greater and graver in a globalized world because we are coming in contact with each other at a much more regular rate, and that can raise the risks and the consequences of an epidemic. It can take maybe a regional epidemic and turn it into a truly global epidemic. Okay? Flows of goods and services. An example, Walmart is a pretty good example of this globalization phenomenon. You probably don't know this, but if you were to shop at Walmart, when you check out at their, with a clerk at their store, their database is sending a message when your, let's say, pair of socks crosses over their automatic register. It's sending a message to the supplier that another pair of socks needs to be sent. And that pair of socks might be coming from Vietnam or something like that. But it's a highly automated process, and their providers of their goods come from a very large footprint of the globe. Free trade is an argument that many advocates of globalization argue. They say that if there are people who can do the job and do it more cheaply in a different part of the world, then those people should be hired for the job, and that will ultimately be the most efficient and best economic arrangement. People move, some for long-term reasons, others for short-term, for business, so the interaction of people becomes much greater. Dominant ideologies, so like I said earlier with China, democracy is an example of an ideology. Not all parts of the world have or practice democracy, but the citizens and people who live in different regions of the world have become more and more attached to this idea of democracy because they've seen it. And so, for example, the discussion yesterday or the video that you watched on Liu Xiaobo, he was very much responsible and is responsible for, among the Chinese people, cultivating this idea and this desire and this dream for a more democratic China. That would not likely have happened in a less globalized world. The influences came to him in part because of his existence in the early 21st century. Okay. Film, internet, and print. Knowledge, information has definitely been increased. The access, the spread of it is greater, and therefore things and ideas spread much more readily in our current globalized world. Uncontrollable negatives. An example of this would be a group like Qaeda. When the world comes in greater contact with itself, it tends to influence and share both good and not so good influences. Other examples of uncontrollable negatives, the exchange of illegal underground arms sales, the exchange of messages of terror. A number of young American men and women have even been found among the ranks of terror groups like Al-Qaeda, and that is also largely the result of globalization. I'm going to show you this video, or I'm going to post this video after I finish recording this screencast, so you'll be able to find this, and I would like you to look at this. You'll see a good example of globalization in the I-economy by looking at this 9-minute story. Okay, and then briefly I'm going to leave this slide up. Democratization, you can stop here if you want. Closely related to globalization is this influence of democratization, and it sort of highlights there appears to be in the world, and events in the Islamic and Arab world of the last 5 years seem to really further support this. There's a desire for the people to make their own decisions, or make as many of their decisions for themselves as possible. And democracies are by no means the only form of government around the world, but there seems to be, again, a momentum and a drive for greater democratization. And part of this theme is also closely related to globalization. Thank you. I'll stop there.